Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and you're listening to The Business of Content, a podcast about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. This week, we're talking about a publication that is produced and written by famous music and Hollywood artists. In 2014, former Major League Baseball player Derek Jeter launched a media company with a novel premise. Called the Players Tribune, it's a sports site that's produced and written by pro athletes themselves. Many wondered if this would result in what are essentially bland, rewritten press releases that would be typed up by publicists, but in its few years of existence, the Players Tribune has produced some astoundingly raw first-person journalism. In 2017, for instance, NBA player Isaiah Thomas wrote about the gut-wrenching pain he felt when the Boston Celtics decided to pawn him off on another team. While not every article at the Players Tribune is Pulitzer-worthy, it certainly has brought forth pro-athlete perspectives that you won't find anywhere else. Could the same idea work for famous musicians, artists, directors, and actors? Several years ago, a record label owner named Ian Wheeler launched a publication called Talkhouse, and it's essentially the Players Tribune, but for artists instead of athletes. I recently interviewed Wheeler about Talkhouse and whether famous Hollywood music artists actually need their own media outlet. Let's jump right into it. Hey, Ian, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Simon. Great to be here.
Well, let's start with just talking a little bit about your background prior to you launching this publication. Tell me a little bit about it. You actually started in art criticism, right?
The very beginning for me was writing about music, but it didn't last long. Only about a year.
You were at like a Alt Weekly or something like that?
Yeah, I was living down in Charleston, South Carolina, and I was writing for the Alt Weekly there as well as the Alt Weekly in Athens, Georgia.
And it was just kind of like a matter when like local acts were coming into town, you were going and reviewing them and stuff like that?
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I was pitching probably 5 to 6 pieces a day to different places. But yeah, I probably had one pitch accepted every couple weeks. Yeah.
So it wasn't like a thriving career in in music criticism.
No. I was just out of college, so I don't blame anyone for not taking my crazy pitches.
But then you transitioned to actually working within the industry itself, right?
I did, yeah. I was doing some artist management at that time. And then I moved to New York, and I was actually teaching sailing. That was my first career, was a sailing instructor and boat captain. So I got a sailing job in New York, and I started interning at Rough Trade Records. And yeah, that kind of began my industry, recorded music side of my career.
And you launched your own record label? Yeah,
a few years after that, I launched a label with my now business partner, Tim Putnam.
What's that called?
It's called Partisan Records.
Yeah. And how long ago was that?
That was 10 years, exactly 10 years ago this year.
And so what was kind of your experience running a label, like in terms of like, I mean, is it like a full business now? Is it mainly just you two, or how big is it?
It's a full business. We have about 20 employees at the label, and we have offices here in Brooklyn. We have a couple people in Los Angeles, a couple people in St. Louis, and we also have a London office. And we have a few people over there.
So tell me about so you're running this record label that, has grown into a thriving business. What made you decide you wanted to launch, basically a digital media publication?
So, with the label, when Tim and I started it, I think he'd been a touring musician for a long time, over a decade. And he'd been on a lot of different labels and, had some mixed experiences, some stuff that he really liked, a lot of stuff that he didn't like. And I'd had similar experiences with labels, not from being on them, just from, being around them and interacting with them, and working closely with artists. So I think the idea when we launched the label was, to start the label that we really envisioned, the label that he never had, that was extremely artist centric. And, from that, we kind of basically decided we were only going to sign artists that had really unique voices, both like literally and in terms of kind of where they were coming from, what their point of view was. And, that was great. That's been our philosophy. That's guided us, for the last 10 years. That said, the industry isn't always super friendly to those artists. They, sometimes those artists are harder to understand, and especially the music media. And I understood this from having, written about music and art. If they don't catch on really quickly, then they move on to the next thing. and especially in the volume of releases that are coming out right now, and have been for a long time, it's a lot of stuff to listen to. And so, it's understandable that a music journalist can put on a record, listen to a few songs, say, nope, this is not for me, and move on.
So the problem is not that they were doing bad criticism. It's just that like there didn't really seem to be like it was really hard to get good sustained coverage in the music criticism space.
Sure, that and in the last decade, a lot of what's happened, and you see this everywhere. A lot of the alt weeklies have gone away. A lot of the classic music magazines that we grew up with have gone out of print. There's been a lot of consolidation. Obviously the death of print has kind of created this vacuum. And so, publications are hiring younger writers. And a lot of those writers, they've never heard Joni Mitchell, or they've never heard certain kind of touchstones. And so I think they hear music in somewhat of a different context than, the people who came before them. And so I think that was a piece of it as well, where, we were reading reviews of our records that we were putting out and kind of wondering, how is this person hearing the music this way? Or how are they kind of missing this big point? And again, I think there's so little money in music writing now. I mean, it sounds silly to even talk about money in music writing. I mean, even the larger publications, to some extent, expect the writing to come for free. And so I don't blame anyone. I think it's just the way that the media landscape has shifted. But yeah, we felt like there was an opportunity to create a media outlet where, actual people who were doing the work themselves were writing about each other's work, and coming from a place of actually having done the thing they're writing about.
And how long ago was this that you guys started forming this idea for this publication?
Really 5 years ago. And it came together pretty quickly.
And so how would the structure work? Like you would assign one artist, like an artist would be coming out with a new album or something, and you would try to find another artist to review it? Or what was kind of the structure that you were at least initially envisioning?
Yeah, I mean, that's basically it. The initial vision was to have 5 review formatted pieces a day. I think that was really ambitious. And then we kind of shifted over eventually to just having 1 review piece a day. At this point, there's no real, we have review pieces, we have essay pieces, and we have probably on average about 3 new pieces we run each day. But a lot of them are long and they're heavy, and, they take some bandwidth to get through. But that was kind of
so one thing.
I'd rather read like 1 really great thing every day than 8 forgettable things. I don't think the media landscape and the way the media advertising structure set up kind of favors that. But, I think in time it will. I think people are increasingly gravitating towards good, memorable stuff as opposed to just a bunch of stuff that's forgettable.
So one thing that I've seen you compare yourself to is the Players Tribune, which was a publication started several years ago, I think by Derek Jeter and some other people. And kind of the concept was very similar to yours in the sense of, like there was this kind of problem, or at least a perceived problem within sports journalism, where players were giving less and less access to the media, and they were kind of wrapped up in their own kind of cocoons and were very protective. And this idea that something that was a little bit more player friendly in the sense that it allowed them to write their own pieces, to kind of approve their own pieces, that this would get them to open up more. Like, was this something that was happening, the Players Tribune? Like, when did it come out in conjunction of like when you were releasing this, and was this like something, what were your thoughts on that? Like, was this kind of like a vindication of your idea? Did you feel like?
Yeah, I kind of felt that way. They launched a couple years after we did. The most exciting thing was there was another kind of channel for this first person media approach, and I felt like the sports space was so great for it because, sports announcers and journalists, they're really 2 types. One is former players, and those are great. The other is just people who have watched a lot of sports, I guess, and they could be really great too. But, the players themselves are really living in the experience. And, I think that's really important, especially in recent years, as we've seen stuff like, concussions in the NFL and CTE, these really big issues that deeply affect the lives of these people. I think it's really important to hear firsthand from, the people themselves. And you have to have an outlet in order to do that. You have to have a place that's really dedicated to that approach, and where people go expecting to hear directly from, the folks on the ground, I guess.
So one of the questions that I think that people have is whether this is actually, journalism or if it's just public relations. That if these players, and then in your case these artists, if they actually have enough emotional distance in order for there to be real truth to kind of speak out. How do you kind of respond to that or deal with that question?
I mean, I don't necessarily think it's, straight journalism as we understand it. I think it's a new form of journalism. If we're talking about distance, I mean, I think something that's really important is proximity. It's easy for us to kind of brush off big issues in sports because we're not playing sports. We're just watching them on the TV. I think the reality is, and we've seen that with the concussion thing where, people say, look, everyone's aware of the health issues within sports and everyone kind of knows the dangers going into it when they play the game. Not necessarily. I mean, I don't think 20 years ago people understood that getting 7 concussions and, over the course of a career could actually result in, dementia and depression and suicide for some people. So look, I mean, I think there are things that you only really understand when you're inside of it. And I think that's why, it's important that these kinds of publications exist.
So you've moved on, or I don't know if this was originally the goal, but it's not just musical artists now, at least based on my reviewing of the website. You guys have like filmmakers, actors, actresses, and stuff like that. How do you go? What's the editorial process? Like, how do you actually solicit the work and work with these artists?
So yeah, we have a great editorial team. On the music side, we have Amy Rose Spiegel, who's been around for a while. She was at Rookie during their early days. She was at BuzzFeed for a while. On the film side, we have Nick Dawson, who was at Filmmaker magazine for a long time. Our podcast producer is Elliot Einhorn. He's phenomenal. And, we're all just kind of every day talking with talent directly or with publicists, managers, whoever will talk to us. And pitching ideas, and over time, it's become more common that we're dealing directly with the talent. And we've found that musicians, actors, filmmakers, chefs, they love doing this. They love being able to write, having an editor that's going to make them sound great. And they especially love the podcast. I think just because they're talking with a peer, they're not kind of going through their usual talking points that they would with, traditional journalists. And they're getting really different questions, and ultimately they're talking with someone who's to some extent experienced some degree of the same, difficulties, challenges, and just life experiences.
And is it hard to navigate this world of publicists? Because based on what I've heard about journalism in this realm, which I don't have a lot of experience with personally, is that I've heard that it's hard to get interviews with artists unless they have something to plug. Like it's a very kind of rigid system where outside of that, it's hard to get a famous actor or director or something to just do, or a musician even to agree to any sort of interview if they don't have like an upcoming tour or movie or television show or something like that. Do you find, and publicists can be very rigid in that regard as well and protective. What have you found in that regard?
I mean, I think that's definitely right. I think we have a slight advantage because, we're presenting people with the opportunity to speak with a peer on the podcast or to write something that, they have an opinion about, as opposed to just kind of, answering questions about their life. Like, what's it like to be on tour? That's a terrible question. It's like asking someone what it's like to go into work every day. You do it. Hopefully you love your job and you get up and you go to work, and it is what it is. So I think, I think artists and filmmakers and actors are actually excited to have an opportunity to come from a totally different place than they're used to having to.
And then how do you develop the story itself? Like, is it just getting on the phone with them and just kind of brainstorming ideas? Is there someone ghostwriting it for, I know at the Players Tribune, they have actual ghostwriters who will help them kind of craft the first brainstorm ideas, then kind of interview them, and then take that interview and craft it into like a first person essay of some sort? Like, what's the kind of process for you guys?
I mean, we do very little ghostwriting like that. For the written pieces, I mean, the talent, the artists, the actors and filmmakers are actually writing the pieces themselves. And then they work with our editorial staff, and it's a very traditional editorial process, a back and forth. And ultimately, we want to make the pieces great. We want to make our writers sound great. And so that's what we're going for. We try not to take their voice out of it too much. And that's always been a big fear of mine is, if we ever get to a point where it's becoming our voice as opposed to the artist's voices.
Uh-huh. And then so it's not just like, oh, here's the first person essay, and then your editors just kind of copy edit it for grammatical errors and then slap it onto the web. There's kind of like a back and forth.
Yeah, there's absolutely a back and forth. And some copy errors we leave in because they're meant to be there. A lot of, especially musicians, we found kind of some of the most brilliant people I've met don't use punctuation. It's just kind of their writing style.
Uh-huh.
And so, we sometimes will try and preserve that. But yeah, I think it really comes down to our editorial staff. They're just phenomenal. They get it and they've been doing it. They do a lot of it and they're really good at it.
Uh-huh. So tell me about some of the pieces you're most proud of over the last couple of years.
I talk about this one all the time, but Lou Reed on Kanye West was a big one, I think, just for the Talkhouse brand. But it was also just it was big for me personally because I love Lou, and it was right before he passed away. And it was just cool. Lou was always known as such a cynical, guy who spoke his mind, didn't hold back. But he got Kanye. He loved it, and his piece it's totally Lou. You read it and you're like, that's Lou. But it's upbeat, optimistic, and I think it was a side of him that a lot of people had never seen. But it was kind of unexpected and very much kind of reinforced, why we do the Talkhouse. Another that I loved was Juliana Hatfield from Blake Babies. She wrote about the most recent Lorde record. And the piece was really good. And, Juliana liked the record a lot. She got it. But the part for me that was great was Lorde was so touched by it. And she said more so than any other review for that record, Juliana understood where she was coming from. And, I think also understood kind of the pressure that was on her to create a great second record. Yeah, I mean, she made a great first record. It became massive. She was in arenas, and kind of the weight of the world was there for her to make a great follow-up. So I was really happy to see her respond so positively to Juliana's piece.
Uh-huh. Prior to, connecting this interview, I read some of the pieces that were on the site. And one thing I did notice is that several of them were kind of very defensive and kind of geared towards critics. They were like how they were, from both pro critics and on kind of online. Like I read one piece from a filmmaker who had to deal with like a bad review that was kind of like not exactly constructive criticism. It was very personal. I read another from an actress who was getting lots of criticism of her characters on social media. I mean, do you think that's like was it just a coincidence that I landed on these few pieces, or is that kind of like a recurring theme within the publication? Like, is this a venue for artists to kind of strike out or respond to their critics in some way?
No, I mean, it's funny that, yeah, we did run a couple pieces recently that had that tone. I don't think we frequently run pieces like that. It's something we're aware of, but look, it's absolutely part of the experience of being a creator. I work with a lot of female artists on the record label side, and that to me, I mean, people take pictures of them playing shows and post them online, and then you have a comment section that says terrible things. And I tell all my artists, never read the comments, never, ever read the comments. But I think that's part of it. The internet has created a place for, faceless people to say terrible things about other people, and I think there is a sensitivity to that, in any kind of review of art when it doesn't get it, when the artist feels like this person either didn't watch my film or listen to my record, or they just totally missed the point. I think a lot of that feeling is kind of fed by, where we're at in culture and society and what the internet's done as far as kind of creating this place where people can say really terrible things with very few consequences. And so I think that's part of the experience of being an artist. I think increasingly you're going to see more artists kind of pushing back against, criticism.
And do you think that's kind of like a healthy and cathartic way to kind of vent, is have a venue, something like Talk House, in which like a more formal venue for them to respond to these critics?
Definitely. I mean, I think, look, you see artists do it on their social media accounts. You see artists mention in interviews like, oh, this person hates my music and hates my film or whatever it is. We're hoping to be a place that can kind of present that pushback in a really constructive way that actually creates constructive conversation, as opposed to, really ugly internet comments or social media back and forth.
And so what are the incentives on the artist side to work with you? Like, are they getting paid, or is this a pure, the kind of prestige of their names appearing upon, next to other famous artists? Like, what's the kind of incentive structure there?
We do pay our writers, and think we pay them better than most arts publications, at least. So there is some incentive there. And I think, there are a lot of artists who write for us pretty regularly and see it as a second source of income. But I think more than that, it's just about developing a voice. And, how they choose to use that voice going forward is up to them. We had one artist who I talk about all the time, Meredith Graves. She was a singer of a band called Perfect Pussy, and they were super buzzy. I mean, they were, about 5 years ago, every label was after them. Everybody was writing about them. She started doing a lot of writing for us and a lot of podcasting for us. And now she's really kind of the face of MTV News. And I think she, in the course of working with us, realized, I really love being in this place of reporting on art and music, and she had the unique perspective of being in the spotlight in that way, being the singer in a band. And so, she does that full time. She's full on at MTV News, and it's really created the second career for her. And so I think we look for, I think that's something that we've kind of realized is a possibility. And a lot of our writers, write for other places now, and they're kind of seeing it. Look, being on tour is super rough, especially when you have, a wife or a husband, when you have kids. It just doesn't get any easier as you get older. So I think having the opportunity to have a secondary source of income and also kind of have a voice, have a home outlet, is really exciting to a lot of artists.
And then is the criteria 100% to, in order to write for your site, like that they have to be an established artist? Like, is there any any plans to, have more traditional journalists that are working for you? Like, or is this always going to be something that's for and by artists?
It's pretty much always going to be for and by artists. I mean, on the podcast side, we're developing some new series where we will bring in journalists, but I think more from a, research and fact-checking standpoint, and less from kind of a straight line reporting standpoint. But yeah, I think more to support, our artist reporters, having some seasoned journalists, available to be resources to them. But yeah, I don't see any journalists writing for the site ever.
So tell me about the metrics side. Like, what's been the audience growth over the past few years? Like, do you feel like you're getting like real market penetration where people are aware of your brand?
Yeah, I mean, it's grown, probably about 30 to 40% each year since we launched. The podcast is where we've seen the most growth, and to some extent there's market penetration. I think also just people are really flocking to podcasts at the moment, and you've seen that just kind of year over year for the last 3 years. Podcasting has just become wildly popular. But yeah, because we don't have regular personalities really, the metrics can vary pretty greatly. You can see 20,000 hits on a piece one day and the piece the next day gets 1 million. So it really is kind of all over the place. But to be honest, I don't think too much about metrics. I feel like, for one, we launched at the weirdest time where display ads just kind of died. I mean, that was kind of, there was a transition phase, and then it was either you sign up with like Google AdSense or, you're going out and pitching advertisers and doing site takeovers and stuff like that. Early on, we were talking with Ian Mackay Fugazi, who is notoriously anti-corporation, and he said something to the effect of like, there better not be any ads running when my piece runs. And it terrified me, and I kind of at that point said, look, we're we're not going to make any money off display ads on the website, so let's not bother with it. So yeah, we've been really fortunate to find brand partners, including Sonos and Samsung and some others that like what we do, and they help subsidize it. And, I don't think they're thinking too much in terms of what the audience size is. I think they're thinking in terms of, the quality of the audience for their product. Does our audience fit the audience they're after?
So in what way are they sponsoring it? Like you say that you're not really doing with display ads, or like, are they doing like spoken ads on the podcast, or in what way are they approaching the advertising?
We do host read ads on the podcast, but with those, with Samsung and Sonos in particular, those were really kind of deep relationships where with Samsung, we recorded once a week out of their meatpacking district flagship store here in New York. With Sonos, we recorded once a month out of their store. Kind of built talks around, what their priorities were. Sonos is launching a home theater product, and, let's bring in some more film. Sonos does a lot of activations around specific artists. They did one last year around Tribe Called Quest. So we actually had Jarobi from Tribe Called Quest record a podcast. And so, we try and kind of align with where their heads are at, and make sure that we're, the audience that they're after, or kind of what they're looking to project out about their brand, we can support it editorially as long as it's cool and aligns with our ethos. And fortunately, with those brands, it does.
So it sounds like the website is almost like a loss leader to help build the brand and the audience for the podcast, which is where your main monetization is.
I would say that's probably accurate.
And that's interesting. I feel like, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but The Ringer, run by Bill Simmons, kind of has like a similar thing where they do have some advertising on the website, but it seems like their main monetization is happening through their podcast network.
In The Ringer, it's funny. I looked at for so long when we launched the site, because they'd have verticals like presented by Subway, and I was like, okay, that's kind of smart, because you're honing in on who exactly you're reaching. And it's kind of hard to say, like, here's the profile of the Talkhouse reader. It's a big audience, and they're all very different. But if we can kind of hone in on, okay, here's who exactly is going to be listening to this podcast, or reading this piece, or following this series of pieces, that's a lot easier to go to an advertiser and tell them exactly who they're going to hit. And I think advertisers are they're worn out. They've been using Facebook and Twitter and all these different kind of online advertising methods for a while. And they're realizing that they've been hitting, not their audience. They've been spending this money and, reaching millions of people. But of those millions of people, maybe there's only, 20,000 that would actually buy the product. And so I think we're kind of at a unique time where, if you can go to an advertiser and say, look, here's a specific profile of the audience we can reach for you, they're inclined to hear you out.
Mm-hmm. And so, like, how big is the audience for your podcast?
Like I said, it just like the site, it varies depending on who our guests are, but on average, it's about 40 to 50,000 an episode. And
it's just the one podcast right now.
Yeah, we'll be rolling out some new different kinds of series later this year.
And then, like, what's your ambition here? Like, you have a record label. Is this like a separate media company? Is this something where you're going to be looking to expand and take investment, or is this going to be more kind of like a small kind of bootstrapped affair? What's the grand 10-year vision from now?
I mean, Talkhouse is a separate, media company from the record label. We don't mix the two things. I think just for editorial integrity reasons, but I think we'll probably look to take on more capital in the next 18 months and try and grow the thing. And, I'm not opposed to Talkhouse being part of a larger ecosystem, that's really committed to this first person media approach. And I think recently in the last 18 months, it's become really important. You see visible figures, actors, musicians speaking out, athletes speaking out online, and in real life. And every single time that happens, there's someone going like, shut up and dribble, shut up and play, shut up and sing. I think people who are in the spotlight have a responsibility to speak up when they see something they, don't agree with morally. And so I think these outlets have to exist. I think Players Tribune has become really relevant and important in the past year, with everything that's happening in the sports world. and politics and, the bleed between those two things. And so, my hope is that at some point, if there are a lot of disparate things like Talkhouse and Players Tribune, there will be some consolidation. We can kind of, leverage each other's audiences somewhere down the road.
Great. Well, Ian, those were all the questions I had for you. Where can people find you?
Talkhouse.com. And the podcast is on all your favorite places to listen to podcasts.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining me. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks so much, Simon.
Okay. That's all I have for you today. Be sure to subscribe to the Business of Content on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. See you next week.